Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to enter this debate on a critical issue for our province. At this point in time, we wish we would have been able to enter into debate on this weeks or months ago, and I wish we would have seen some action from this government in years past, months ago, in preparation for the challenge that we're facing right now. Maybe I'll just touch on one issue here that's rather interesting and I think pretty telling. This issue was so important to members opposite and the federal Conservatives that when producers held a meeting just this past Sunday in Raymore, Saskatchewan, or a day-long meeting, in fact, you might be surprised, Mr. Speaker, because this apparently is an important issue to the member that was just speaking, or to the member from Last Mountain, or to the Premier, or to the Agriculture Minister. But do you know how many of them showed up? Because there's 48 members, Mr. Speaker, many from rural Saskatchewan, many that represent farm families and farm businesses across this province. Do you know how many showed up, Mr. Speaker, to that meeting in Raymore? Not a one. Not the member from Weyburn, not the member from Arm River Watrous, not the member from Last Mountain Touchwood, not the Agriculture Minister, not the Premier. They didn't care enough to show up to a meeting to listen to producers that came out because of the grain transportation crisis. Now, this is pretty telling, and it's consistent with the actions and behaviour of this government on this grain transportation crisis, because they've been non-existent from the get-go in bringing forward real solutions that address the grain transportation crisis. It's also noteworthy that their kissing cousins, the federal Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, were also not at the meeting. So it was awfully strange for other federal parties to be represented, for our federal party, the NDP, to be there, for the agriculture critic from Nutana to be there at the meeting. I attended the meeting all day there. Many of the many municipal leaders were at that meeting that are now at SARM here this week. We're also at that meeting. Many producers from across the province. And this is simply represents what we've seen from this government all the way through. What we've seen from that government, what we saw with the announcement from the federal government, is simply too little, too late, and it's far too weak. The circumstance that we're dealing with right now was entirely foreseeable, and that's the sad reality. When that government, along with the federal governments, intervened to dismantle the wheat board without a vote of producers, there was one voice, or a voice, that should have been listened to, setting aside the marketing debate. Because in the end of the day, that marketing decision should have been up to producers, not this Premier, not the Prime Minister, not me. It should have been up to producers. But the one thing I heard from producers across this province, setting aside the marketing decision, was that what was being dismantled as well was a transportation logistics system and clout with rail companies. And it was heard from folks on either side of that debate that this government and the federal government better be doing something to ensure that a logistics system for transportation would be in place and some clout would be there for producers. Those guys dismantled that system and replaced it with nothing, Mr. Speaker. Fast forward, that's a couple years ago. Last year, when there was opportunities to make improvements to the Fair Freight Rail Amendment Act, federally, that government failed to provide any support for amendments that would have actually been meaningful for producers, and the federal government actually voted against amendments that were put forward that would have ensured service-level agreements, the one we now hear late coming from the Premier, service-level agreements that would have been actually enforceable from a legal perspective and would have allowed producers to actually receive some compensation directly back to them. So, as I say, this is an entirely foreseeable challenge and crisis that we've come around to, with no actions from that Premier, no actions from the federal government to address the challenges that are in place. Not to mention that it was an exciting summer last year. I recall we started out with a really wet spring, and sort of in through August we were celebrating Rough Rider victories, which we all were. And we were touting this record crop that was being produced. So producers clearly did their work last summer. They did everything they needed to do to produce a record crop, something that government was willing to celebrate, that we were all proud of. But that government, again, not recognizing that they had a responsibility and that they failed to act to ensure that the grain transportation system was there to make sure that producers could get that record crop to port, get that record crop to market, to make sure that they could get paid. Now, the reality is that producers have not been paid in many cases all across this province. They have grain sitting in bins that they're wondering when it's ever going to be able to be moved, whether they're ever going to be able to pay for it. They have, or get paid for it. They have grain bags all across Saskatchewan that are right now having all sorts of damage that are being caused to them, and also a big question of how to prepare for the next growing season. We have piles of grain across this province that in fact are rotting, with producers not getting paid for that record crop and their hard work. Of course, all of this is highly unfortunate. We know as well that it wasn't a secret that the big rail companies have been making massive cuts over the past couple of years. In fact, in 2012, CP engaged in one of course, the two big rail companies. One of those companies, CP, actually cut 4,500 workers, 11,000 rail cars, and over 400 locomotives. And that wasn't enough of a wake-up call for that premier to realize, or the federal government, that they were going to have a challenge on their hands when it came to capacity. Now, we've been calling for actions on this for a long time, Mr. Speaker. We were out listening to producers that were saying that as the transportation network and system that was in place was being dismantled, that something needed to be put in place. That government failed to listen and rejected that call from producers. As we've got into the winter of this year with this record crop going to waste in many cases, with producers with bills and loans due, with that record crop rotting in many circumstances, and with commodity prices collapsing, Mr. Speaker, because of the inaction of this government, the federal government, and the poor performance of the rail companies, producers are now getting a terrible price for their product. I know just a couple of weeks ago, wheat was selling for $4.80 here, or producers were receiving $4.80 here on the prairies, and at port they were receiving well over $10 for that crop, basis that had grown to a massive amount. So the matter of fact that out of this crisis, many shippers, many transporters have been making big dollars out of this, but our producers have taken a big hit, a $5 billion hit without any compensation. We've been calling for, as I say, in January, it was dismissed by that agriculture minister and that premier who were late to the scene, calling for performance standards to be established that could be legislated, and to ensure that reparations and compensation would go directly back to producers who are taking the hit. Mr. Speaker, that agriculture minister brushed that off, said that the rail companies would sort it out, treated the big rail companies with kid gloves when he needed to utilize a little bit of muscle on behalf of Saskatchewan producers. They also rejected our call for open access to be considered, or joint running rights, to get just a bit of competition on this rail system that right now is a duopoly, monopoly, no market at all, and make sure that our short-line rail companies and other companies can be part of the solution. We called for immediate opening up of the CTA to make sure that actions could be taken then to address the crisis that was unfolding and a reality for Saskatchewan producers, but this government was certainly dismissive of the concerns of producers and not aware of the realities that were going on, or they simply didn't care, Mr. Speaker. The announcement that we saw just a week and a bit ago, and the fawning over the announcement from the agriculture minister and the premier, was weak. It was weak by a provincial government that should recognize that $5 billion in farm incomes is something that's big, that recognizes that our producers who have done the hard work deserve to get paid. It was weak for not addressing the real numbers needed for rail cars to get that grain to market. We believe that the penalties that were put forward, along what we're hearing from producers, the penalty that could be up to $100,000, sounds like a big number for some, Mr. Speaker, but that's walking around money for the railroads. That's walking around money for Hunter Harrison, Mr. Speaker. And those dollars, Mr. Speaker, don't flow back to producers. They're going to be collected by government. That's wrong, Mr. Speaker, and doesn't address the issue. We have a crisis on our hands. We need immediate actions to address the crisis. We need short-term actions to do just that. And we need structural change that's going to serve the long-term interests, not just for producers, but for the Saskatchewan economy. And it's past time that that government stop tripping over itself to fawn over the federal government, that they start standing up for producers, that they stop treating the rail companies with kid gloves, and that they start pushing some real solutions that are going to work for producers across this province, like mandating some fleet size and rolling stock, like mandating the locomotives that have been cut across this province, and ensuring, as I say, that producers are the ones that receive the dollars back, because, Mr. Speaker, they're the ones that have taken the hit and they're the ones, Mr. Speaker, that are bearing the consequences. So we will continue to support, call for strong leadership, real actions, legislation that makes a difference, not scrapping things like revenue caps that provide a bit of protection for producers, but real solutions for the Saskatchewan economy and producers in this province.
I reckon